Welcome to this video about TRS-Bridge. TRS-Bridge is a 4x4 MIDI router and merger. You have 4 MIDI TRS inputs and 4 outputs, and you can connect an input to one or multiple outputs, or you can have an output and it can receive MIDI from one or multiple inputs. Each input and output have an LED and a button. If you start up TRS-Bridge, it's in the status page, and here you can see incoming and outgoing MIDI data. MIDI data is color-coded. Nodes are coded in red. Now I'm receiving node data on channel 1, and I'm sending out the same node on output 1. Clock is in blue. As you can see, I'm now receiving clock on input 1, but it's not sent out at the moment. And finally, sysx is in yellow. I'm now receiving sysx on input 1 and sending it out on output 1. The colors can be combined. If I receive nodes and clock at the same time, for example, the input turns purple. If I receive clock and sysx at the same time, it turns green. And I've received nodes and sysx, it's orange. If all kinds of MIDI data is received at the same time, the LED turns white. There are multiple ways to route MIDI. Let's start with simple routing. Simple routing routes all kinds of messages at the same time. To route an input to multiple outputs, we just select the input. It will blink in white. And then we can turn on and off the outputs it will send MIDI to. If I now turn off the routing again by pressing the button again, you can see that the clock is routed to all the outputs here. You can also select another input and do the routing here. Or I select an output and define from which inputs it receives MIDI data from. Note that only one of the LEDs here is white and the others are orange. This is because clock data can only be received from one input at the same time. So TRS-Bridge will make sure that that is in fact the case. You can also route nodes, clock and sysx independently. To select node routing, press the upper 2 buttons at the same time. They will blink in red to indicate that node routing is now active. You can now select an input or an output the same way we did it in simple routing. I could select input 2 and then define which outputs the nodes are routed to. Or I could select another input. Or I press the buttons 1 and 2 again and select an output and define from which inputs it receives MIDI from. Press the blinking button again to exit routing mode. And the very same way you can route clocks or sysx data. If you have created a routing like I did now, you can save it by pressing the 2 save buttons simultaneously. Save will light up, and I can now select one of 8 slots to save the configuration. I choose slot number 2, and now it's saved. I can load this configuration by pressing the 2 load buttons. Load will light up, and I can load from any of the 8 slots. If I now select slot 1 and I have a look at the routing, it looks like this. And if I load slot number 2 instead, you can see it looks completely different. Or I load slot number 8 and you can see completely different kind of routing. There are 2 types of MIDI TRS. TRS type A and B. TRS-Bridge automatically receives both types A and B and its inputs. For the outputs, you can select type A and type B for each output individually. Press the TRS A and B buttons. You can now see color-coded if the output is A or B. A is in red and B is in blue. By pressing the buttons you can switch between A and B. Press TRS A and B again to exit this menu. Finally, we can also change the LED brightness. First, press the two LED brightness buttons to enter the menu, and you can see a bar that shows the brightness. You can change the brightness by pressing the buttons. Now it's very low, and now the brightness is very high. Press the LED brightness buttons again to exit this menu. There are also some additional features. For example, if I route nodes, normally if I turn off a routing, that might cause hanging nodes, because a node on had been sent, but no node off. TRS-Bridge avoids this by memorizing which nodes are currently turned on, and if you turn off a connection, it sends MIDI off messages. Another nice feature is clock restarting. Normally, if you would deactivate a clock and maybe at a later point activate it again, the receiving synthesizer or drum machine would be out of sync. TRS-Bridge avoids this by sending stop and start at the right moment, so the receiving synthesizer will always be in sync. As you can see, I have a clock coming into input 1 generated by Microtune, and I connected a TR-545, my sequencer with a 6mod6 drum kit, and MC202 to the outputs. And if I now go to the clock routing menu and select input 1, I can turn on and off the clock outputs and they will always start in sync. I can use this to start and stop the gear. Let's do it.